Always measure the rotor in several places to determine the minimum thickness, and compare this reading to specifications to make sure the rotor is thick enough to refinish. Loosen and remove the caliper retaining bolts. Remove the caliper from the bracket. Use a caliper hanging hook to hang the caliper from the strut. Do not allow the caliper to hang by the brake hose. Remove the brake pads from the caliper bracket. Loosen and remove the caliper bracket bolts. Remove the bracket from the vehicle if the vehicle utilizes a bracket. If the rotor has a retaining bolt, such as this, it's not necessary to remove the rotor from the vehicle. If the rotor is going to be removed, go use a paint marker or tire crayon to mark the rotor so it can be reinstalled in the proper position. If there's rust on the rotor around the lug studs, it'll be necessary to use a hub resurfacing kit. This is used on a drill to clean up the area around the lug studs. This ensures that the brake lathe will be mounted correctly, and the wheels will also be mounted correctly when we're done with the brake job. Locate the correct adapter for the vehicle you're working on. Place the adapter over the lug studs and onto the hub. Make sure it's centered onto the hub. On some vehicles, you can use the vehicle's lug nuts to hold the adapter in place. On other vehicles, it'll be necessary to use the lug nuts or lug bolts that come with the brake lathe. Install all the lug nuts onto the adapter. The lug nuts should all be torqued to approximately 35 foot-pounds. Never exceed 40 foot-pounds when torquing the adapters, or 54 Newton meters. The adapters can be damaged. The vehicle should be positioned on a lift and raised up until the rotor is about waist high. This will make the use of the on-car lathe the easiest. Roll the lathe up. Align the lathe onto the adapter and spin the rotor until the alignment pin engages in the lathe. Tighten up the hand screw to tighten up the lathe onto the adapter. The screw is only hand tightened. If the screw is difficult to turn, make sure you're not cross-threading it. Before turning on the lathe, make sure the crossfeed adjustment knob is pulled out. Also make sure that the cutting bits are not going to contact the rotor when you start the lathe. Before turning the lathe on, make sure you have enough clearance between the lathe and the body of the car, as the lathe will jump slightly when it gets turned on. Turn on the power switch for the lathe, and the lathe will begin spinning the rotor. Press the start button and the lathe will begin calibrating. Once the lathe is calibrated to the run-out in the hub and bearing assembly, the lathe will light up the lights saying Ready to Cut and Optimum. And the display on the lathe reads 0.8, meaning the run-out is 0.08 of an inch. Make sure the yellow lock screw is loosened. Turn each of the cutting adjustment dials back several turns. This will move the cutters away from the rotor. Do the same on the inboard cutter. Loosen the cutting head adjustment screw and slide the cutting head until it's centered on the rotor. If the cutting bits are still too close to go around the rotor, loosen them up some more. Once the cutters are positioned so they will not hit the rotor and the cutting head is centered over the rotor, tighten the cutting head lock bolt. Check the clearance between the cutting head and the wheel well of the vehicle. Loosen and adjust the lathe stop lock until it's just touching the sensor, and tighten the screw back down. As soon as the lathe moves beyond this point, it will turn off the lathe. This will prevent the cutting head from hitting the wheel well of the vehicle. Begin spinning the rotor feed knob in a counterclockwise direction. This will move the cutting head into the center of the rotor. Once you're approximately in the center of the rotor, stop. Make sure the chip tray is positioned under the cutting head of the lathe. Turn the cutting bit dial just until the cutter touches the rotor. Now, pull out on the cutting bit dial and turn it until it reads 0. Make sure the cutting bit control knob snaps back into place, and the 0 should be lined up with the line. Now, turn the adjustment screw to back the cutter off approximately 0.005 inches, and adjust the outboard cutting dial until the cutter touches the rotor. Once you hear the cutter touching the rotor, stop. Pull out on the adjusting dial and turn it until it reads 0. Once again, back the cutters off approximately 0.005 inches. Once again, spin the cutting head feed counterclockwise. This will bring the cutter bits closer to the center of the rotor. Be careful not to run into the center hat of the rotor, and use a mirror to verify the positioning on the inside of the rotor. Make sure you remove any rust ridge that will cause noise later on. With the lathe positioned correctly, turn the cutting bit back to 0. And now, set the depth of the cut. Always remove the smallest amount that you can to properly surface the rotor. We've set this cutting dial to remove 0.005 inches from the inside of the rotor. Always remove the same amount from the inboard and outboard side. We're going to adjust this dial to also remove 0.005 inches. Place the silencer pads over the rotor and down onto the cutting bits. Tighten up the yellow lock screw. Push in on the rotor feed dial, and the lathe will begin feeding the cutting head. And the rotor will be machined as the cutting head moves away from the center of the rotor. Wait until the cutting head has completely passed the edge of the rotor, and then you can remove the silencer pads. Pull out on the cutting head feed and turn off the lathe. Carefully inspect the finish of the rotor for imperfections. Make sure you use the inspection mirror to check the backside of the rotor. If the finish looks okay, you can remove the lathe from the vehicle. Make sure the cutting bits are clear of the rotor, and loosen the hand screw to remove the lathe from the adapter. And pull the lathe away from the vehicle. Loosen and remove the lug nuts holding the adapter to the vehicle. And remove the adapter from the vehicle. Use brake clean or water to clean the rotor off thoroughly. Some manufacturers do not recommend using brake clean to clean a rotor off. Make sure you clean the inbound side of the rotor also thoroughly. A clean shop towel can be used to remove the water from the rotor. If the shop towel is dirty like this is all the small pieces of metal trapped into the rag. Clean the rotor off again with water until the rag comes out clean. Once the shop towel remains clean when wiping the rotor, you can reinstall the caliper onto the vehicle. To cut the rotor on the opposite side of the vehicle, it may be necessary to flip the cutting head over. Loosen up the lock screw and spin the lathe over. Make sure you always spin it motor side up. And lock the lock screw down again.